Oh, hey, you're here. I'm here. We're both here. And we're talking math. So let's get into talking about math today. As you can see from our board here, as I frantically tried to figure out if that's not working. Oh, there it is. Hey. We're talking about the multiplication of decimals and whole numbers. Now, last video we did talk about this, but we actually kind of had this mixture of whole numbers and decimals. And today we're really going to talk about what happens when we take a whole number, when we take those numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 10, 13, 1000, 24, whatever is a whole number. We multiply it by a decimal. And in this case, we're all going to be multiplying by decimals smaller than 1 because those are the decimals. There will not be whole numbers when we multiply. As always, we're going to have 3 steps to help us through that. We're going to multiply without decimals, very similar to something we did yesterday. We're going to count place values, which is something we're doing constantly. And then we're going to put the decimal back. So again, we will talk about these steps. Let's go ahead and dive into it. We're going to go here. And we kind of have our steps over here in the corner to help us out. And let's go ahead and dive into our first problem. The first one we may want to look at today is let's take the number 7. And let's take a thicker marker than that. There we go. Let's take the number 7. And let's multiply that by, let's say, 3/10. Okay, so let's just start there. Now, if you notice, one thing we don't have in this moment is that estimation value, right? Which was so helpful last time. And here's why. If I really think about what's happening here, if I was to estimate this, right? Well, if I was to estimate 3/10, well, my options are kind of like 0, 1/2, and then like 1, right? And we could kind of like argue that maybe we want to like think about rounding this to 1/2. So what's half of 7? And that would be a good idea, but that's a little confusing. And then we could say, okay, well, let's just round this to 0. Well, then 7 times 0 is 0. And that's going to be really hard to estimate once we do our math and be like, well, my answer was supposed to be 0. Or we could say this could round to 1. But if we said 7 times 1 is 7, well, that's not really an estimation because our answer should be 7. But when we do the math, we get something different. And we don't know where the decimal goes and things get confusing. So knowing and understanding place values of decimals is super important. Estimation proves a little more difficult in this skill. So this is why we're doing the steps that we do. And we'll look further as we go into this about what that means, right? We'll learn more about this. So don't panic if you're like, what the heck are you talking about? Because as always, we will learn. So we're not going to estimate. We are just going to start with multiply without our decimals. So again, I'm just going to look at this as 7. And I'm going to multiply this by 3. Again, when I say no decimals, we're just going to pretend like the decimals aren't here, right? We're just, oh, hey, there's no decimal here. It's just a 3. I'm just a 3 here. So if we multiply that, we get 21. Okay, so that right there are the digits that are in my product. So I'm going to go ahead and come down here and say, okay, well, 7 times 3/10 is a 2 and a 1. But again, now we got to talk about where does this decimal play. And if you go back to our estimation, if you remember, we could have been like, oh, our estimation is either 0 or 1. Well, 2 and a 1 doesn't really help us with that. So again, let's go back to step 2. Step 2 says to count my place values. And what we mean by that is that literally when we went and ignored our decimal, we were ignoring a place value. So when I ignore this decimal to multiply, I'm actually ignoring this place value, which means I ignored one place value, right? I ignored the tenths place. So I'm going to count that as one place value. And then I'm going to put that decimal back by going in one place value. So look what I do. This is where it would be, right? Because it's a whole number, but I'm actually going to come in 1. And that ultimately gives me the answer that 7 times 3/10 is 2 and 1/10. And this is what gets wild because look what finally happened. We have not seen this in math yet. We talk all the time in multiplication that when we multiply numbers, we get larger in value. And this is typically always true, right? I start with 7 Well, if I multiply, I should end with a number larger than 7, but I don't. I actually end with a number smaller than 7, right? So this is now our mind's like, wait, what are you talking about? Why would this be the case? How is this possible? And this again goes back to the identity property of multiplication. We know that 1 times is 7, right? We know that 1 times 7 is 7, but we're multiplying with a number smaller than 1. 3/10 is smaller than 1. We know that. If we, oh boy, where do I put all this on a screen? Go away. If we put this on a number line, right, we know it'd be between 0 and 1. It's base 10, so I'm going to break it into 10 pieces. And these are tenths. So like this is 5/10, or right in the middle. And 3/10 is actually right here. Well, 3/10 is smaller than the number 1. So it's true, when we multiply by decimals, just decimals, things smaller than 1, our answers actually get smaller. Crazy. I know, it's crazy. So that's the why. Let's talk about more about the how, like how do we do this skill? So let's go to the next page and play this game some more. So multiply without decimals, count our place values. I think that's going to be our biggest challenge, and then place the decimal back. So here we go. Let's take 24 and let's multiply that by how about 7/10. Okay. So again, we're going to multiply without the decimals. So I am going to just treat this as 24 times 7. It's just how I'm going to treat it. So let's do an area model for that. So I have 20 and 4, and I have a 7. And again, as I always say, if like the area model doesn't make sense, then go back to the area model video and watch that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about how I use area models to multiply. That's something we've talked about before, and there are videos in our folders for you to look at and watch to remind yourself. So I'm going to go ahead now. I took my expanded 24. I'm going to say 7 times 2 is going to give me 14. But it's not a 2, it's a 20. So it's 10 times greater. So I need another 0. And then 7 times 4 is 28. I'm going to add these two numbers together to get my product. And again, what I'm going to end up with is the digits that go in my product. But now I got to think about those place values. Now, what we did learn already, and this is where now estimation could come in a little handy, is that we just multiplied something smaller than 1. So my answer should actually be smaller than 24. So I could think about where that decimal would go. Like it's definitely, it can't go here because that'd be 168. That wouldn't make sense. So there's that about where's my decimal go? This has to be smaller than 24. What makes sense? But there's also the steps. And remember the step out here says, well, I'm just going to count the place values I ignored. Well, I ignored one place value, right? The 10th place, I ignored it. So I need to put the decimal back in one place value. I need to put the tenths back in there. So when I take 24 and I multiply by 7/10, I get 16 and 8/10. Now I can understand if this is still feeling really confusing. That's okay, right? That's why we practice, we ask questions, we continue, and we just keep working at it. It also can be very confusing if we're still not sure about place value. So again, if place value feels confusing, go watch the place value videos, right? There's always something out there to entertain you. Like, why wouldn't you want to spend 40 minutes of your night just watching videos of me talking? Just kidding. I mean, of course you want to, but that's a joke. You don't have to do that. Unless you want to learn, which is rad, so do it. Okay, let's do this one more time. So multiply without decimals, count decimal place values, place the decimal back. This time, let's go ahead and take 4 and let's multiply that by 1200ths. Yeah, I'm crazy. So let's start and really think about math right away. This is really small. It's smaller than 1, right? It's just above 1/10. It's below 2/10. It's a small number. So my answer is going to be smaller than 4. That's the one thing we're going to have to start learning. But I don't always have to put that into play. I can just say to myself, well, let's just follow this. Let's multiply without decimals, right? Let's just follow the steps. And that's also another great way of learning. So 4 stays the same. I'm just going to call this 12. And let's see, 4 times 10 is 40, and 4 times 2 is 8. So this gets me 48. So I know that 4 and 8 are the digits in my number. Now, what is crazy about this is I know my answer has to be smaller than 4. So I can already start to think about where my decimal goes, but that's okay, because even if I'm not like clear about where my decimal goes, we have our steps. And the next step tells me to count the place values, meaning count what I ignored. Well, this time I actually ignored 2. Look at 1, 2. I ignored 2 place values, the tenths place, and I ignored the hundredths place. Whoa. Yep, there it is. So I ignored 2 place values. So when I go to put my decimal back in, I actually need to go 2 place values, right? So we're going to go 1, 2, and see that my decimal goes right here. So I'm going to actually rewrite all that. 4 times 12 hundredths equals 48 hundredths. And that makes sense because, again, look, I now know when I multiply with decimals, which is crazy, my answer gets smaller, and 48 hundredths is smaller than 4. Had I put my decimal like here, that would be 4 and 8 tenths. That's bigger than 4. That wouldn't have worked. So that's the crazy thing about the work that we're doing here, is like really thinking about what do these numbers mean? And if we're not sure what these numbers mean, no biggie. Let's just use our steps, right? I wanted that to be a bolder pen to be dramatic. There we go. Let's just use our steps, right? Multiply without the decimals. So just ignore the decimals, multiply. Count the place values, meaning count the decimals you ignored. If you ignored 1 decimal, that's 1 place value. If you ignored 2 decimal place values, that's 2 decimals for place values. And then place that back into your product. So like we did here, because I ignored the tenths and the hundredths, then in my answer, I had to make sure I had a tenths and a hundredths. Okay, as always, continue to ask the questions. We thank you for your time, your dedication. Remember our math norm. If it doesn't make sense, keep asking until it does. Math is about learning, exploring, and making mistakes. It's not about instant answers. It's not about being right away. So keep up the good work. We'll see you soon. And thank you for your time.